hardly any neuroscientist will pretend that we know really what consciousness is, for a very good reason, is that it's a matter of experience. And experience is experience as the first person. You cannot know what experience is by describing everything from the outside, what kind of neurons have been activated, what kind of area of the brain. Even you knew the function and the activity of billions of neurons when you are angry or see the color red or feel love, that will tell you absolutely zero so what it feels to experience love or anger.
So modern science now tells us that meditating or training your mind for a relatively short window of time can create pretty big changes in behavior and outcome. But what if you actually spend somewhere between 40 and 60,000 hours in meditation? Well, that's the life that today's guest, Matthieu Ricard, has lived. Growing up in France, the son of a renowned philosopher and an acclaimed painter, he started to stake his claim as a scientist in molecular genetics when he decided to actually make a pretty fierce left turn and found himself living in a hermitage in Nepal studying Buddhism. He eventually took his vows and became a monk and has lived there ever since, full-time, devoting himself to the study and the practice and the relieving of suffering. Along the way, he has started a foundation called Karuna Sechan, which now serves, it helps educate and provide healthcare for some 300,000 people. And he has written a series of books, the latest of which is a really fascinating dialogue between him and a friend of his, Wolf Singer, who is a neuroscientist, around how classic Buddhist practices rewire your brain. It's called Beyond the Self. I had the opportunity to sit down with Matthieu as he was here in New York for a brief amount of time before returning to Nepal. And we went deep into both his own personal journey, how he made decisions like leaving sort of popular mainstream life as a rising scientist to become a monk in Nepal, to how all of these different practices profoundly changed him and his life, and how it has also inspired him to then return to a certain extent and participate in the evolution of science around these practices, and also begin writing again and sharing and publishing books, and also heading up this foundation, Karuna Sechan. So really excited to share this conversation with you. I'm Jonathan Fields, and this is Good Life Project. I'm fascinated by you, by your story, by your work. And what I'd love to do is sort of touch down in different parts of your story. Grew up in France, in a family that seems like it was very steeped in scholarship, in philosophy. And from what I know, your dad was a philosopher. Your mom was at one point.
She's a painter, and she's 94. And we just last year helped to make a book of 70 years of her painting, which was a beautiful photo book. And they did a big exhibition of 70 years of painting.
How wonderful.
So she's still alive, and she doesn't paint anymore because her hands are getting too feeble. But she knew all the painters of her time. And simply she left for India for 20 years, so that made a fatal blow to her career, but she was already exposing in museums, and she did scene sort of paintings for Maurice Béjart, who is a famous choreographer. So she would have a nice career, but she became a Buddhist nun as well. So that's usually not very good for PR for a Parisian painter.
To vanish for 20 years. What drew her to that? I mean, if she was very much on a path as a painter, what made her then become a Buddhist nun?
I was a scientist and a photographer, and I became a Buddhist monk. So I guess probably the same reason that I moved from a scientific career to study with Tibetan master is that, you find very interesting people in the artistic world, in the science world, in the intellectual world. But it not necessarily gives you, role models for living a good life, and also to become a better human being, to also be more at the service of society and go at the root of the mechanism of happiness and suffering. So, Parisian life is not particularly conducive to flourishing. And a lot of tormented people. And also, the thing that struck me, and I guess it struck her as well, is that you meet all kind of people who are genius in their own fields, but that doesn't translate necessarily as being a good human being. So it's puzzling for 18 years old to see those great mathematicians, scientists, philosophers, and some of them are wonderful people. Some of them are absolutely impossible, but it does not seem to have nothing to do with their other skills for which they are sort of renowned. So there's this kind of discrepancy that is incoherence in a way that is puzzling. While after I met those men and women of wisdom in the Himalayas, you can't have a spiritual master that is very respected and sometimes say, he's a great master. What a pity he's so angry, jealous, arrogant. It doesn't work because they are respected as spiritual teacher because the messenger is the message, and they are people of compassion, of wisdom, of inner strength, of humility. And so whatever you look as a human quality, you will like to become like them, not just to know the skills that they have developed.
It's so interesting the way you phrase that. I'm asked often how I choose who to bring into these conversations. And one of the things that I've realized, maybe I didn't realize I was doing it in the beginning, but I've realized since then, is I look for what I would call embodied teachers who don't just have incredibly bright things to say, but when you look at the way they live their lives, when you're in their presence, you just feel there's this, to use your word, coherence.
Yeah, so I spent 7 years nonstop with the teacher, another 13 years after my first teacher passed away with the second teacher, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And that, for many years I was his kind of attendant, means I was sleeping on the floor in his room. He was very old and being there all the time when he was meeting kings and when he was giving teachings to farmers, all kinds of situations. And in 13 years, I never ever witnessed an action or a word that could remotely harm anyone. It's not that he was, like a passive, everything is okay, let everyone run over me. He was incredibly strong, and you were in a feeling of awe in front of him. But no any crack or defect in the armor of unconditional loving kindness, but not this kind of softy, sentimental one. He could be strict, but also you knew it was just for getting rid of some of your defect. So the mixture of being like a mountain, unshakable mountain, and you could not find defects. So, and it's not also something showy or self-advertising. It's something that you discover with time. So even you cannot judge of the ultimate enlightenment of someone from the inside. But that coherence that you see over the years in private, in public, with humble people and with the, supposedly, big stuff, this is a teaching in itself. Mm. Because, if you see of someone, I've never seen him doing anything that could be remotely harmful to someone, you say, well, of course, but, it's not very common in daily life. Someone who never hurted someone.
Indeed. So I want to fill in a quick gap. So we were talking about your mom and her decision to take her path. You started down a very traditional path. You started down the traditional path of academics and science, and you pursued your PhD. And it sounds like the reasons that your mom and you both changed course pretty dramatically were pretty similar, because you then went from the world of science and academia to a monastery in Nepal.
Well, first of all, yes. So again, I traveled when I was a little bit over 20 in 1967, met a great master, including the one who's become my first main teachers. And then I came back and forth, many times. I think I went 7 times back and forth until I finished my PhD, going every summer for a month.
So even while you were pursuing...
So I had really a lot of time to mature that, not to make sort of hasty decision, and to let this be a natural sort of culmination of aspiration. It's like I like the example of an apple on the branch. If it's too early, you pull hard the green apple and you break the branch and you get a fruit that is not edible. When it's ready, you just put your hand and turn a little bit and it falls in your hand. So when things are ready, it's natural, effortless, it's the obvious things to do. So after 7 years or 6 years at Pasteur Institute, it was the clear thing that this is where I wanted to live, the kind of person I wanted to be with, and what I wanted to dedicate the rest of my life. And retrospectively, now I'm nearly 72, I feel incredibly fortunate that I took that decision at the right time, because too early might have been a little bit premature, would have created difficulties with my father, sort of waste of all the education. Too late would have been a waste of time. So it was perfect.
Yeah, I guess you follow your intuition to a certain extent with that.
It became obvious, those things, people, how can such a difference, you live the Parisian life, a scientific career, just go to the Himalayas, to a small hermitage without heating, electricity and running water. Must have been a shock or something. It was the most natural, obvious things to do. You cross a mountain pass, discover another valley, and you're happy to settle there. It was absolutely just a small, seamless transition. Even from the outside, it looks like a big jump.
Yeah, but I mean, it really goes along with what you were saying earlier, which is that you see people of arts and science in a big city with huge accomplishments in their field. And yet underneath that, so often, the more fundamental science and art of just living a good life is not being expressed.
Well, it's not that they are, of course, scientists are all bad people. Yeah. They are extraordinarily good people. I just come from Madison, Wisconsin, where I've been collaborating with Richard Davidson, who is a leading neuroscientist. He's such incredibly good human beings. What I was mostly saying is that there's no obvious correlations. Yeah. Be a very good scientist doesn't mean that you'll be a very good human being. You can be terribly mean also, while you need that coherence for a spiritual master.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no point.
When you decided to actually stay full-time for the first time, from what I know, and tell me the details, you didn't immediately take vows as a monk. That still took a number of time.
Monks may also seem something from the outside that's quite visible, like a walking flag almost with this colorful dress. And again, for me, it was a no-brainer at some point. So I sort of settled there when I was 26. And then after 2 years, I spent 7 years in Darjeeling without going anywhere. And after 3 years, my first teacher passed away in 1975. So I stayed another 4 years in a hermitage. I did over maybe 5 years of solitary retreats with some guidance from time to time. Then in the late 79, I went with my second teacher, Dego Kensere Moshe, he was giving 4 months of non-stop teaching to thousands of devotees, monks, and lamas. So, until 30, I didn't know whether I would have a family life or not. Both solutions seems to be, equally interesting in a way. So at that time, there was someone who was very well known for giving monastic ordination. And I was more or less living in a very simple way. So I asked my teacher, would it be good to just simplify my life by becoming a monk? He said, great idea. It would be very good. So at 30, I took monastic vows. But again, it was also effortless, just like a little step over something. And I felt great freedom because, I could not imagine, if you have a family and children, of course you have to have some responsibility. I mean, you cannot just say, okay, hi guys, I'm going to the mountains for 3 years in retreat, and so I wish you well. You can't do that. And so it's a wonderful adventure to raise up children. It's a wonderful act of love and enriching experience. I'm sure I've seen that. Now we founded through our humanitarian organization. Now we have 30,000 children in our school, so I have all the time with kids, and in our monastery we have young kids also. So I see that, but at the same time I wanted to one-pointedly pursue the spiritual path, so it was much easier to just be completely free. If I want to get up, I get up, and the only thing I leave behind is my footsteps. I have no house, no land, no car, no nothing, so I'm just completely free.
Good Life Project is supported by Ring Floodlight Cam. Ring's mission is to make neighborhoods safer. Today, over 1 million people are using the Ring video doorbell to help protect their homes. And it doesn't stop there. They've actually extended that same security to the rest of your home with a super cool product called the Ring Floodlight Cam. Just like the amazing doorbell, the Floodlight Cam is a motion-activated camera and floodlight that connects right to your phone with HD video and two-way audio that lets you know the moment anyone steps on your property. You can even see and speak to visitors. It'll set off an alarm right from your phone. And with the Floodlight Cam, when things go bump in the night, you immediately know what it is. Whether you're home or away, the Ring Floodlight Cam lets you keep an eye on your home from anywhere. And the Floodlight Cam also offers the ultimate in-home security with super high visibility, floodlights, and a powerful HD camera that puts security in your hands. Save up to $150 off a Ring of Security kit when you go to ring.com/goodlife. Ring.com/goodlife. That's ring.com/goodlife. You mentioned solitary retreats or time in solitude for what to a Western mind would seem like an inhuman amount of time. I think we tend to have trouble with being with our thoughts for a few hours, and you're talking about being on retreat for years. Tell me more about what this experience is and also why it's important.
Well, you see, if you build a hospital, you might say, oh, no, it's not a good idea. You are a surgeon. Why don't you operate in the street, emergency? And that's, the time you will spend 3 years, all the construction work, the plumber, electricity, that's a waste of time. It doesn't cure anybody. Zero. But when it's ready, it's so much a powerful tool to alleviate suffering. So the idea is to really perfect yourself, to become a little bit more of service to others. Because I can see now in the humanitarian world, where I'm quite engaged, we have 200 humanitarian projects in Asia. Now, what derails very often such projects are usually a lot of conflict of egos, people burning out, or worse, corruption. So those are human shortcomings. So instead of, doing a training for NGOs by how to do proper audited accounts, etc., which is, of course, necessary to be transparent. But one of the main ones would be to grow your fortitude, your resilience, your determination to be at the service of others and not just see how people treat you, what they say, what they do, not trying to, everybody should be perfect on the way. You're about to build a school somewhere, but your job is not to make everybody perfect. Your job is to build the school, make everybody perfect. That's the job of the Buddha. So in a way, to have this inner sort of, to cultivate these fundamental human qualities is definitely not selfish. It's actually preparing you better to be of service to others.
Mm. And then the extensive time in solitude is sort of a mechanism to allow that to happen on a deeper level?
The solitude is definitely not to get away from people. It's like, say, you could see a musician, an athlete who is early in the morning, alone in the training in the stadium where there's no spectators, and again and again he runs or swims, or 3 hours of swimming in the swimming pool. This is sort of not very glamorous, you could say, but that what allowed them to then, be at the top of their qualities. So if we are like a little bit like a wounded deer that's high in the forest until the wounds are healed, then it can gamble and frolic around with other deer. So our wounds are not just the wounds of suffering, depression. It's really in case of basically healthy mind, healthy body person. There's still the wounds of ignorance, of animosity, jealousy, arrogance, craving. Those are afflictive mental state that we all have to different degrees, and those are source of torment for oneself, torments for others. So in a way, we need to give us the time to go the root of that, to uproot them. Especially the Buddhist path offers a whole array of methods to do that, and they're very rich, they're very complex. So you need to go to this systematic training of the mind to free the mind from those toxic elements. So that takes time, because it took time for those to form in your mind, thought after thought, emotion after emotion. So it's not just like a magic bullet that within 3 weeks of a self-help book or something, you will get rid of animosity and craving. This is just like nonsense. So it takes time to make real progress. And that's why we do that. Like it takes 10,000 hours for a pianist to play well and be at his first concert. So some of my friends, when we evaluated roughly the numbers of hours of practice when we went to the lab, we don't usually count that, of course. It would be stupid. But for the neuroscientists, they needed to know roughly what we went through. So many of us had done 40 to 60,000 hours of practice or meditation.
Yeah.
So that makes a difference.
It's huge. So it's so fascinating. So it's really less about solitude. It's less about withdrawing yourself from other people. It's more about creating the conditions to allow yourself to just focus intensely on the practice.
And also, it is freeing oneself from this scattering, distracting, endless, noise of so many aspects of daily life. This crazy speed and those solicitation of the mind. I was with a Tibetan Lama one time in Times Square, seeing all those, lights. He said, they are trying to steal my mind. So that your mind is completely stolen by the ads, the radio, the news, the social, encounters where everybody scrolls blah, blah, blah. And then the mind is even 10 times more blah, blah, blah of the neurons. So that's not a conducive sort of conditions to mature something over time in a deeper way. So the solitude, the conditions of, not always completely alone, there might be other retreatants, but the suitable condition that you can pursue, especially at the beginning, this process of transformation will be constantly taken away from it.
Yeah, and it's really the conditions to pursue this sort of, what I guess in almost modern terms would be considered the deliberate practice, to allow yourself to not perfect, but I guess cultivate the stillness, the awareness.
Well, yes, people know that, musicians, they spend hours and hours every day. So nobody finds that strange. Actually, they are admiring the kind of self-discipline and dedication. So this is about doing the same thing with the mind. So it will be a mystery if all those qualities will be at the top right at the beginning without any training. That will be an exception for sure.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that you made that comparison, because when you think about athletics or arts or performance or science, well, of course, people assume naturally you would focus on this one particular field and you put in your time. You do the work to become, as good as you can be at it. But when we're talking about just perfecting the mind in the name of living a better life or relieving suffering, we don't have that same lens.
Well, that's what we call mind science or contemplative science. And also it's not with the idea of becoming an extraordinary performer, like a champion. So the idea of performing better than others is not the point. It's the idea that it takes time to cultivate those qualities. And now the reason why I did this dialogue with a great neuroscientist, Wolf Singer, over 8 years of meeting from time to time, is precisely that over the last 20 years, the neuroscience has found out that the brain can change until you're dead. Before, it was thought that once you reach adulthood, the brain is so complex that if you were changing something, it will mess up the whole thing. And then it was found with various ways, that in animals first and then in humans, that anytime you become exposed to a new situation or you train in something new, whether it's singing, juggling, or in that case meditating, or even learning as London cab drivers would learn 14,000 streets by heart, their brain change. So then the same thing happens with training in compassion, training in focused attention. So that's why it was a natural encounter for Buddhist contemplative to work with neuroscientists. And there's a new field, we could say, that's called contemplative neuroscience. And last year in San Diego, there was a symposium that was the third one of anyone interested in those fields. Clinical application of meditation, neuroscientists looking at the change in the brain. There was 1,000 scientists, not just like, self-help people, but really serious scientists coming for see what is the progress in the field. And there's more and more research being done in that sector.
Yeah, it really is interesting to see those two worlds coming together. And it feels like it's just the last 10, 15 years that really it's caught on. There's a tremendous amount of research and publication.
Yes, absolutely. The number of publications on mindfulness has gone from 20 per year 20 years ago to I think it was 400 last year.
Yeah.
And also we found some when I discussed with Wolf Singer in this book called Beyond the Self. We call it like that because one of the findings that we found so similar between the Buddhist approach and neuroscience is that there's no central post of command in the brain. The brain is all about synchronicity between different areas, dynamic rearranging of those different areas talking to each other, and the result is a particular mental state. So it's like emergent phenomena all the time, completely dynamic, with every area talking to each other, and there's no, like a hub in the middle, like the control tower in an airport. So that is very close to the idea of the lack of inherent existence of the self in Buddhist philosophy, where we say, of course, there is a self, but it's a conventional label that we give to the dynamic flow of experience that our consciousness goes through that makes our personal history, but there's no autonomous, separate, permanent entity that is the self. That is often the case when you think of the soul in Christianity or the Atman in Indian. There's a kind of entity. Buddhism said there's no. It's just a dynamic stream, and to that we give a label of a name or an individual. But so, in a way, over the years, by collaborating with neuroscientists, I found that it's a very easy and natural collaboration because we don't have stumbling blocks where science and Buddhist Buddhist approach of the mind are irreconcilable. The only big contentious issue is the nature of consciousness. Is it 100% the brain or not? But there's no such thing as saying, okay, according to our scripture, the world was created in 6 days and that's it. So now, of course, science, it just can't go on like that. It doesn't work. So then you're stuck. But with the Buddhist exchange, we are not stuck. You're just continually exploring in an empirical way.
Yeah. I mean, it feels to me like a lot of that really easy relationship also comes from the fact that Buddhism is not sort of, I'm coming from the place of a neophyte, but my experience of Buddhism is that it is not sort of a hierarchical, theological, traditional religion, the way that you look at so many others where there is some entity or some being and there are supernatural claims which you either buy into from a place of faith or not, without judgment either way. Whereas Buddhism has always struck me as more of a science of living that within its own teachings opens itself up to testing and validation.
Well, Dalai Lama said if any tenets of Buddhism is clearly refuted by science, then we have no problem of abandoning it, no issue at all. But there are things which still, is far from the view of most modern scientists, especially about the nature of consciousness, where Buddhism says, the matter, it cannot come ex nihilo, the idea of creating something from nothing and becoming something. There's a lot of logical arguments against that. It cannot also disappear into nothingness, so that's a primary phenomena. But he said the same is true for consciousness. Because you see a present instant of my consciousness, immediately preceding instant has to be of the same nature. You can have an unconscious moment. A next immediate moment is conscious. So there's to be a chain of conscious moment continuing because the cause has to be, the result has to be somehow coherent in nature with its cause. So that means also there is a beginningless stream of consciousness, and it also cannot come to complete end. It cannot disappear into nothingness. So that aspect is quite far from what most neuroscientists believe, the reductionist approach, or the physicalist approach of consciousness being just a property of matter, of the complexity of the neurons and so forth. But still, hardly any neuroscientist will pretend that we know really what consciousness is. For a very good reason, is that it's a matter of experience. And experience is experience as the first person. You cannot know what experience is by describing everything from the outside, what kind of neurons have been activated, what kind of area of the brain. Even you knew the function and the activity of billion of neurons when you are angry or see the color red or feel love. That will tell you absolutely zero so what it feels to experience love or anger. So this pure experience, you cannot get out of it to study it. So that is what is called in the science, the science of consciousness, the heart problem. So even Western philosophers call it the heart problem. And you can't get out of that. So in a way, certainly there are different perspectives about that. In that sense, Buddhism and most of the neuroscientists will not agree. But still, it's a matter of investigation. It's not a dogma.
Yeah. Building on that, though, I think, and this is where I struggle with some of the ideas as well. I feel like it builds on this point that you're making, is the idea of reincarnation, of consciousness sort of moving from one manifested state into the next and the next and the next.
So that is vastly, usually not very well understood for cultural reason.
Okay.
In the West, it's not at all in the culture. In the East, whether you a sophisticated philosopher or not, people, it's part of their worldview. Now, they said it very exotic of thinking, a young child remembering past lives and all that, although there are hundreds of such testimony, but now how can you test that scientifically? That's another point. But that's why the real issue is the nature of consciousness.
Right.
So first of all, to dispel misunderstanding, Buddhism, so-called reincarnation, is not about an individual entity jumping from one body to another one through passing to some mysterious stuff. Because there's no such thing as a self-autonomous self. So it's more like, as I mentioned briefly earlier, the fact that the stream of consciousness cannot be born ex nihilo and cannot entirely disappear as well. Because that moment of consciousness now will trigger the next one. So that process goes on. So that's the view. So again, it's not about an individual entity sort of jumping from one life to another. It's the continuation of a flow of consciousness, just as, the world of material phenomena is ceaselessly transforming, but even something like an object is broken or is burned, but that doesn't mean that the particles, the atom, goes into nothingness. It transforms into something else. When your body dies, it goes and it's eaten by worms and we're all sort of stardust in a way. And so that doesn't go into nothingness either. So that's the view of Buddhism. So the point of the continuation of consciousness beyond this association with the physical body is really comes down to what is the nature of consciousness. And so far, that question, even from scientific perspective, is far from being settled. So the discussion with Buddhist contemplative and philosopher is still very much alive.
Yeah. I want to talk about meditation with you because it really does seem to be at the center of the practices that allow for the cultivation of all these states of being towards the end of relieving suffering and living well in the world. You, in your teaching and in your writings, describe a couple of different styles, approaches, types of meditation. From what I've seen, at least 3: compassion meditation, I believe what you call open presence.
Open presence, yes.
Right. What's the language around the third one?
You see, actually, people speak of meditation. It's such a generic term.
Yeah.
It's like training. So,
right. So tell me what you mean.
You tell to one of your friends, okay, I decided to train. He's waiting for what comes next. Are you training in chess or swimming? So it's the same. If you train the mind, what are you training the mind to? To become a merciless sniper that will harden his mind so that he will kill anybody that he's supposed to do? That's a form of training. You are hardening your mind and chasing away all forms of compassion. So your brain will change. Now, instead, you decide to train focus attention. So the areas of the brain linked with focus attention will be changed, and your way of being will be changed. Will be more attentive, more present, less distracted, more lucid, less carried away by ruminations and expectation and hope and fear. So that's one thing. Now, we all have a potential for loving kindness and compassion. We know that. We can be unconditionally kind with a child, with a dear person, whoever, an animal. But it comes and goes. It's like fledgling. It's not certainly at its optimal point. Like any skill is not at its optimal point at the start. So this we can train. So that's another kind of meditation. Now, very often we have a very sort of narrow mind. And everything that happens in that small space, it's like a firecracker in a little box. It creates a lot of damage. A firecracker in open space is almost unnoticeable. So likewise, open presence is a state which is extremely lucid, extremely clear, yet so vast. You know that the little thoughts of hopes and fears, they will be much more not able to destabilize you, not able to carry you away into of all kinds of reaction that will end up in torment. So it's kind of space of inner freedom. And that's key for emotional balance, for having the resources to lead the ups and downs of life, and for inner freedom, to rest in a peaceful state of mind where you're not the slave of your own thoughts. So all those are different type of training that belong to the vast realm of meditation. So there's no such thing as meditation as one thing.
Yeah, so it's really it's different approaches for training.
It's different aspects of training, and certainly not emptying your mind and relaxing and getting as stupid as you can.
The way that we're often told is just clear your mind of all thoughts, which
but it doesn't work anyway.
Nearly impossible.
Who has ever cleared all his mind from work? It doesn't last more than 5 seconds.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting though is so you just shared these three different methodologies, and attached to each of them, you also shared a certain outcome that I think from the outside looking in, we would say is desirable, or maybe not. How does the training relate to you attaching to wanting that outcome? Like, are you training for the purpose of that outcome, or are you just training?
Well, one of the outcomes is to be free from attachment. So again, you see,
right.
The argument that meditation is selfish because you could be helping others. If the goal is to get rid of selfishness, it's not selfish. If the goal is to get rid of stickiness, of craving, of clinging, of grasping, it's not yet another form of attachment. And we warn people, if you attach to the result and the goal, then you are the medicine becomes a poison. So because the goal is freedom from attachment. And if you are free from attraction, repulsion, hopes and fears, then animosity, hatred will not grow, compulsive craving will not grow, you have no reason to be arrogant, you have no reason to be jealous. So if you get rid of all these kind of graspings, that freedom actually is a goal that you cannot be attached to, because it's the essence of freedom. So it's like saying, in the middle of the sun, can you find an area of darkness? So it's really dissolving the very notion of craving at the root. So that freedom is desirable because who wants to suffer? Nobody wants to suffer, and suffering comes from those things, from hatred, from craving, and so forth. So to aspire to this freedom is not a form of attachment. It's like the person who is suffering for so long and is just fed up with that. This kind of weariness and lassitude. I want to get out of this vicious circle. So that aspiration is legitimate. It's not like grasping to a kind of blissful state or something, like a little artificial paradise.
Yeah. You've referenced a number of times now that you have, for a long time now, had scientific collaborations, sort of exploring, working with neuroscientists, really looking at what's actually happening within the brain through this devotion to practice, to training over a long window of time, and also looking at the difference between the brains of people who've been doing this. I think you said 40,000 to 60,000 hours, somewhere in there for you, and versus somebody who's fairly new to this. When you talk about, aspiring to freedom, what is the neuroscience showing us changes within the brain of somebody who has engaged in these practices extensively for a very long time versus somebody who hasn't?
Well, the point of doing so was some kind of natural curiosity for knowledge. as an ex-scientist, when during a meeting of the Mind and Life Institute in 2000 on destructive emotion, where there was many of those great neuroscientists present in India at the residence of the Dalai Lama, and I was participating. And when the Dalai Lama asked us if, what can we contribute to society through these encounters, and the idea of doing a research program came up. And then, since I was an ex-scientist, I thought, okay, I will come and we'll see. So the idea and that collaboration has become more and more fruitful was not just to prove that meditation changes you. After all, we know that. We don't, and personally, we have no need for outer proof, because if you become a better human being and somehow it's because of the training you have undergone, it's just if the lab tells you that your brain have changed, then so what? But if you want to introduce it in secular ways, in schools, in all kinds of walks of life, I think nowadays, since most people put their trust in science, except a few crazy people, happens sometimes, unfortunately, these days. But since science is a kind of source of valid knowledge, so if science, confirms that there's a real change, you're not just fooling yourself, by being relaxed and feeling good, but then the next moment you are confronted with difficult situation, you are, again, just as before, as unequipped to deal with those human situations. So what was found, is that, each type of meditation has a different signature in the brain, and those changes are very significant when meditators engage in specific meditation, like compassion. There's area of the brain related to that, like parental love, empathy, positive affect. They are activated much more than they would be in untrained subjects. And then after time, you also see structural changes. Those areas, the gray matter is increased in volume, the number of connections is greater. So simply like muscling your arms or those areas grew stronger. They are more salient in the brain. So that became quite clear. And also when you ask those meditators to perform certain behavior tasks, like attention task. There was a task very simple that's called sustained attention task, vigilance task. So you see numbers on the screen like from 0 to 10, and it's a small number. The flash is 3 or 4 per second, and then each time there's a 0, you push a button. That seems very simple. But what happens is your attention gets tired. After 10 minutes, performance decrease sharply. But with trained meditators, they do that for 45 minutes with 0 mistake out of 1,000 trials. And they don't seem to think it's a problem. So they have a tool that has been perfectly, become more flexible, that is well trained. And so maybe attention is a great thing, but it's all the more interesting if it's about emotional balance, it's about loving kindness, to be a good person and kind, benevolent, etc. So now it's quite clear. And that's we reviewed in the Beyond the Self with the book with Wolf Singer. We have a big chapter on meditation on the brain to sort of make a quick review of this science. And recently, again, there was we did with Richard Davidson and Antoine Lutz, we did an article in Scientific American about the long-term effect of meditation. So now it's widely accepted in the world of science.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me also about the conversation in your latest book was the idea of efficiency, was the idea that when you start, and it makes perfect sense because when you think about, again, using the analogy of athletics or art or something like that, when you start something, it's very labor intensive and it's very inefficient in your brain, and you're using a lot of energy because you're not wired for that in the beginning. Right. But over time, through repetition, your brain becomes, it redirects all its wiring. It reconnects the neurons in a different way, and it becomes super efficient at this thing. So if you're talking about something like compassion, in the beginning, it's a labor to effectively, because if this is not your natural state, you've got to rewire things. But what I found fascinating was that over time, it seems like it just becomes, from a behavioral standpoint, it just becomes much more the way that you are in the world. But it looks like there's neuroscience to now support why that happens.
Yes. It becomes contrived, difficult, and you don't do it well. And then in the middle, it still requires some effort, and you do it okay. In the end, you do it perfectly without effort. It was very interesting that in the attention task, they measured the beginners and untrained subjects. Those who have done, reasonable amount of training, medium, say 5,000 hours of practice on attention, and then the long-term meditators, more than 30,000 hours. What they found is in the beginning, the attention areas are highly recruited. If you give them an attention task, they really try hard. The brain area are strongly activated, but they still don't perform very well. It's like you learn how to ride a bicycle. You are very nervous, a lot of attention, and still you're very clumsy. Then the mid-term meditators, they still have to engage those areas very strongly, very actively, and they perform reasonably well. Now, if you go to the long-term meditators, they are absolutely good at the attention task, but they only need to slightly activate the attention area because they are sort of, they are so well tuned. And I remember, it's like entering the flow. I remember a downhill Olympic skier, a woman who became gold medal. And she says, when I won that downhill race, I felt like a river. It was totally effortless and beautiful. So that's the consummate skill. And so all those qualities, including well-being, which is a cluster of quality like loving kindness, inner freedom, those are skills that you can train. And that's, I think, one of the main features that came out of the collaboration between neuroscience and meditators.
Yeah, and I loved seeing that. It's really illuminating. I had this really interesting reaction to it. I'm curious what your response is to it, which is it's just such a clear manifestation of a Western mind where I said, wow, this is fascinating that you can actually see that happen in the brain. And then I looked at the numbers that they were using. It's like you said, the difference between somebody who's considered kind of a newbie at around 5,000 hours of meditation versus somebody with, 30, 40, 50,000 hours of meditation. The Western mind in me is like, wow, so somebody who's considered, a novice has already got 5,000 hours in.
But interesting, I think, for society, because, who is going to do 5,000 hours and even less 50,000 hours? So if it wasn't the case that the second wave of research was about people doing 20 minutes a day, as we do for physical exercise, over a certain number of months. So if that has given hardly any result or difference, then you say, okay, that's good for you in your hermitage in the Himalayas, but that's something out of mainstream. So it doesn't concern us. It cannot bring good to society. There's no point trying to put meditation in school because, this is out of reach. Now, since it turned out that even 4 weeks of 20 minutes a day of caring mindfulness or a kindness curriculum like Rishi Davidson is doing in Madison and his Center for Healthy Minds, if that already gives a behavioral difference, kids become more pro-social, less discrimination, more emotional control or balance. If that happens within 4 or 10 weeks, and you can see in the brain that the neuroplasticity is already beginning to take place, then you say you are into something for society. And that's the case. And most of the clinical intervention now of mindfulness-based stress reduction, the MBSR, that was started 30 years ago by John Kabat-Zinn, it's obviously done with patient that goes through this 8 weeks training, right, and that gives tremendous, good, precious results. But that's different. You have there sometimes university professor or truck drivers or anybody. There's absolutely not people who have been inclined to meditate before. But what is interesting is they continue after the training, most of them, because it brings them such benefits. So that is the main point, in fact, for society, outcome of our collaboration.
Yeah, so it's more the actual, it seems like, interestingly enough, the behavioral outcome manifests far more quickly than the sort of neurological efficiency in the brain.
Well, you can see the change happening in the level of the brain, of course, but it's not as big. And also, you see all kinds of change in the immune system and in all other aspects of our health as well.
Right.
So the real goal ultimately is to get rid of the cause of suffering, but in the meantime, you get also some bonuses on the way.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, because you talk about this in the recent conversation, there's always, once you see something where there's a benefit, then one of the questions always is, can I, quote, hack this in some way? Can I use neurofeedback, biofeedback substances to try and get these similar benefits without having to actually do the slow, painstaking work. And we're seeing that a lot. So I'm curious.
Like that's like kids who want everything right now and make a tantrum.
It was not just kids, and now, but we're like the grown-up versions of those kids.
But you see, okay, athletes, they say Olympic athletes, unfortunately, there's been a lot of cases of doping, right?
Yeah.
So because they're all at the top and they want to get this slight edge on their competitors. But imagine, nobody would have thought, okay, I'm not going to train at all. I'm just going to train a substance and I'm going to beat Usain Bolt. It will never work. So they do that as enhancers. But you don't need substances. You can put, sometime for people who suffer from epilepsy, you have to find out some place in the brain where you can put some electrodes so to neutralize the fits. Now, while doing that, you have to look. So you open the skull and you put some electrode and try to find the area that will prevent epileptic fit. While doing so, the scientists found that sometimes they put the electrode in a particular area and people feel incredible bliss like they never felt in their life. Like unbelievable bliss. Take out the electrode, boom, it's gone. You put it a little bit next, within seconds, they feel there's no need for me to be in this world. It's obvious to them. They want to, they will commit suicide in 1 minute. Take off, come back. So, you could do that. You could put substances in the brain, but just there are like stimulations of the brain, but there's no neuroplasticity. The moment we take off the trigger, the drug, the electrode, it's gone. So it doesn't replace training at all, because training brings about a complete restructuration of several areas of the brain. Not only one area that is sort of muscled up, but the way the connectivity with other areas is changed. So basically you are changing the brain in an incredibly complex way that never any specific substance or stimulation or feedback will ever do. And also the idea that, you would put a few electrodes on the forehead, and when you engage in meditation, it goes beep, 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 or you hear birds singing, and through that you can know that you are in the right thing and you could do further. I mean, it's like children's game. Compassion has to be recognized, or loving kindness. You have to identify that feeling. You have to live with it for hours and hours and hours. And then gradually it will soak in your innermost being and it becomes not a second nature, but your nature. So you don't need those beep, beep, beeps to do that. You need sound instruction from a qualified teacher and a lot of practice.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm curious about all of this. I'm curious about any technology or training methodology.
It's tempting for people to bring up with gimmicks and stuff.
I think it is, because we want to get there now.
We want a quick fix.
But there's really interesting research around. So I'm not somebody who dabbles in any sorts of substances. There has been some really interesting research that's come out over the last few years around experimentation with certain psychedelics and end-stage cancer patients, how they're mired in feelings of anxiety and fear, and in a single experience with a substance like psilocybin, during the moment of the experience, has them reconnect with spaciousness and expansiveness. And what's interesting to me is, in at least the research I've seen, is that even once they're out of the immediate effect of it, the few hours, the diminishment of anxiety and the feeling of spaciousness and being completely at peace seems to sustain. So that's where my curiosity
I guess if you had the insight that the mind can be in a very different state.
Yeah.
Not through training, but to either a psychedelic drug or sometimes through near-death experience. Near-death experience is when you get some accident or some terrible thing. You're almost about to die, but you come back. But you had some incredible experience when it was at the borderline between dying and not dying. And many of those experiences are mind-opening. So to see this vastness, this possibility, even though you don't experience it, is as having been somewhere with a beautiful landscape and that there's something there. So that comforts you on the idea that, there's other things. It's not completely limited to our little sort of narrow state of mind. And that might give you some kind of encouragement to slowly build something in that direction. This probably won't be exactly the same, and probably is the good thing. But that we usually underestimate the power of transformation of mind, because we see that within minutes, if you have this substance, the mind behaves so differently and experiences the world so differently. So we say, okay, if that's a transitory state, but now if you tell me that through sustained training, I definitely can enhance vastly my compassion. I can become free from, animosity, this vicious anger, jealousy, a state of inner freedom that comes with some kind of deep sense of fulfillment. No, I tend more to believe that possibility because I've seen briefly a glimpse of that. It's like a teaser of a beautiful movie.
It's like the trailer. Right.
Trailer.
I like that visual, actually. One of the things that you also speak about, and this is something that's just kind of fascinating to me as well, is as training the mind, various approaches to training the mind become more and more popular and people are exploring them, there's science around it in popular practice, there can be side effects. There can be unintended effects of this training and practice. I don't know if you'd call them side effects, but it doesn't just make everything better for everybody.
Is that so?
Apparently, I'm told.
Well, I think I would call them more unexpected bonuses, usually.
Yeah.
Side effects, it depends what you do. If you put someone who is extremely disturbed, sometimes people call it neurotic or whatever, but let's say someone who has a lot of difficulties, a lot of inner suffering and conflicts, who is at the edge of depression, whose mind is really in a difficult state, very confused, a lot of conflicting things and so much cause of inner torments and suffering. Now, all of a sudden, if you put that person, okay, now you do a 10-day, completely silent, 10 hours a day, intensive practice, their mind might go completely wild and sometimes they may fall into these things could escalate in the wrong way. But that's simply because it's not the way it's not a very healthy way to proceed. Now, if someone is disturbed, then first of all, especially in Buddhism, there's so many teachings that usually in traditional way come much before doing meditation. Seeing what are the different things that bring about suffering, craving, like rumination. So first analyzing the very causes of suffering, realizing that human existence is so precious. You are giving this opportunity, for whatever lifetime you have, to go from this state of confusion and suffering to a more sort of state of freedom and goodness. So you have a fantastic opportunity given, like giving a field to a peasant. You also have to reflect on impermanence. That is, you will die, but you don't know when. So suddenly you start to set you put the foundation with a worldview, and then, okay, what are the causes of suffering? It's animosity, rumination, hope and fear. First looking from the outside with the help of someone to identify those. Then how could I use some antidote? You're given all kinds of tools. You are not just dumped into a meditation room and say, sit there and do nothing, don't move and deal with your mind. And that mind is such a chaos. It is sort of destroy yourself. So I think it's basically, just sort of inappropriate situations that normally would never happen if you do it in traditional way with an authentic or qualified instructor.
Yeah, so I guess that's the big point, is that it's important to do this in the right context, under the right instruction, where it's not just the training, but also its guidance and its teachings around that, and it's the tools that also support it.
Well, once in my life, I've been in a Maserati. This guy in Paris took me, and he said, if I put the accelerator to the ground, the car is going to spin on itself because it's so powerful.
Yeah.
So I said, well, it's not something to put in the hands of a Buddhist monk. So, likewise, there are methods to first clean your mental house, and everything has to be gradual and progressive. So you don't put someone who has never piloted an airplane on a supersonic jet. You put on a flight simulator where it's no risk of crashing, and slowly you learn.
Nah.
Or you don't learn to sail on a boat on a super hurricane day. You learn with a fresh breeze on a beautiful day with a qualified sailor, and slowly you gain skills.
Makes perfect sense when you phrase it that and kind of lay out the picture that way. It occurs to me as we're speaking that the, quote, career that started with you in science has never really ended.
Well, it did. There was a big gap because for, say, 30 years, I was completely on my own with my teachers my own, not coming back to the Western world, with my teachers in the Himalayas, practicing in a small hermitage, studying the scriptures, hardly reading any Western book in either French or English. So I have a big gap of them, what happens in the world in those days. And it was kind of an accident when in 1997, someone proposed that I do a dialogue with my late father, the French philosopher Jean-François Revel, The Monk and the Philosopher. And it became a huge sort of bestseller in France. So suddenly it was, thrown back into the Western scenes, and then it sort of snowballed because I did other books with the astrophysicists, so. But of course, I never imagined that I would go back to a scientific lab. So it's only in 2000 when I was invited to participate in the Mind and Life Institute, and later I've been close associate with the Mind and Life Institute since then. I'm part of the family. We founded a Mind and Life Europe now. And so then, yes, I went to the lab, first as a guinea pig, then as a sort of collaborator, because the meditator has to co-design the protocol of the study with the scientists. Otherwise, how do you study meditation? So they made me co-sign some papers to show that it's not just subject and guinea pigs, but also full-fledged collaborators. So yes, I was certainly not expecting that. But again, I don't do it that much. I go maybe a few days here and there, several times of the year, to do the nice thing, which is to go in the scanner, try experiment, different states of mind, and then my scientific friend have to crunch the data for several months. I don't do that. I go back to my mountains.
I want to start to come full circle with you. I know her. So, final question, really. Well, two more questions, because one is just a curiosity for me. Monastic life. When you go back and forth between, when you spend the vast majority of your time there, and then you enter back into, you go to Wisconsin, you're in a laboratory environment, you're in major cities. How is that for you?
But the only reason I do that is, to share ideas that are dear to me. I believe that the collaboration is useful to society, not the programs in school. So it's the idea of benefiting others in different ways. Then, the books in the beginning brought some resources, and I don't need them. So I started this humanitarian organization, Karuna Sechen, thanks to not only the books, of course, but after that, this expanding and a lot of philanthropists and, joining us. Now we are helping nearly 300,000 people every year in the field of health, education, and social services in northern India, Nepal, and Tibet. So that's also a reason why I sort of continue to move back and forth. And also there's an opportunity when my friend Wolf Singer asked us to do this, propose that we do this dialogue together over 8 years that's just published by MIT Press. So, it's tempting with such a great mind to spend time on and off, a week every year over a long time, and then we mature this dialogue. So of course, it is inspiring and this mutually enriching. But if I was thinking that it doesn't as much use, then I will happily stay in my hermitage nonstop. And that actually I'm contemplating doing that much more because, now I've been doing that for 20 years, and I think I could share whatever I could, and at some point, there's no point going into the civilization of repetition. So I think I've done what I could. The humanitarian projects of Karuna Session seems to will continue on their own merit, and I think probably I've talked too much. So it's time to go back. As my dear 94 years old mother says, silence is the language of the future. So I'm trying to put that into practice.
How often are you in touch with your mom?
Well, because she's 94, I go much more often to see her. So I know I spend several months every year.
Oh, nice.
Because it's nice to be together.
Yeah.
And she lives with in a Buddhist center in south of France, where all my friends who I met came to the Himalaya as well. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, they also lived there. They're a group of translators, so it's like sort of my heart friends. And so it's nice to be there when I'm not in Nepal, this kind of place where I feel comfortable to be.
Yeah. So as we sit here, the name of this is Good Life Project, and one of the things we're really just exploring, what does it mean to live a good life? So if I offer that question or that prompt out to you, what comes out?
So I think a good life is not only, of course, a life where you flourish. I mean, really a life where every moment is felt worth living. And then when you look at 10 years, 20 years, you say, well, that was worth to be alive. So that sense of feeling fortunate, deep satisfaction. And for that, I can't believe that it can happen if you try to pursue happiness in a selfish way. I think it's a self-destructing concept. It will never work because me all day long makes you miserable. It makes miserable everyone around. So I think genuine fulfillment and flourishing can only come through, a big heart, unconditional benevolence, and that's fulfills the aspiration of others, of course, because it is the point. But also that's the best way to fulfill your own aspiration for happiness. So there's a win-win situation. Selfishness is a lose-lose situation. So that's really, I'm totally convinced of that. That's also why before this, Beyond the Self, I wrote a much too big book on altruism, 800 pages, because I wanted to make a case that this is the most pragmatic answer to the challenges of our times. For the care for future generation, for the environment, care for social justice in the midterm, and more caring economics in the short term. Altruism is the answer, not selfishness. So that's, I think, a great source of joy to have shared some ideas. And now, as I'm getting older, I want to gain some freedom to continue my path.
Thank you.
Most welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. And thanks also to our fantastic sponsors who help make this show possible. You can check them out in the links we've included in today's show notes. And while you're at it, be sure to click on the subscribe button in your listening app so you never miss an episode, and then share the Good Life Project love with friends. Because when ideas become conversations that lead to action, that's when real change takes hold. See you next time.